Thank you for tuning in to Exeter TV. Exeter TV is the town's public and government access channels, available on Comcast Channels 6 and 22. Channel 6 is your channel. If you have an idea for a program, want to host your own talk show, or submit a film, we're here to get your content on television. On Channel 22, we bring you live and replay coverage of government meetings and other town updates. A third channel, Blue Hawk Media, is operated by SAU 16 and can be found on Channel 8, with all your school sports, events, and meetings. You can watch Exeter TV online at exeternh.tv, Apple TV, and on Roku. Find us on social media for extra content. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell to get notified about live streams and new content. Tune in to our platforms every other Friday to watch the Exeter Biweekly Report with recaps of recent events, updates from town departments, and messages from nonprofits in your area. If you head to our website, exeternh.tv, we invite you to sign up to our newsletter to receive monthly updates about new content, upcoming meetings, and more. We'd like to thank you for taking the time to watch Exeter TV and hope that you tune in to our other content as well.
Tonight's program takes place in Misquamscook, now called Exeter, in Nadakina, the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki people past and present. We acknowledge and honor with gratitude the Alnabak, the people, who have stewarded Nadakina and its Aki, Nibi, Alaquakak, and Awaasak, the land, the waterways, the flora and fauna throughout the generations.
Thank you, Barbara. I should look at her. Thank you, Barbara. My name is Laura Martin, and I am the other co-executive director of the Exeter Historical Society, and I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight, in person or virtually, to learn about snow trains. Now, if we only had some snow. I'd like to make a few quick announcements. Our February program, in which Barbara will explore the history of the nurses' school in Exeter, will be virtual only. This building is otherwise occupied that evening, and given the winter weather, which we expect to happen, we decided to hold the program entirely online. We hope that you will join us by Zoom, Facebook, or on Channel 6. We want to thank Exeter TV for bringing all of our programs to our members and friends virtually. They are making it possible for us to reach a much larger audience, and we truly appreciate it. Please check our Facebook page or the events page on our website for more information about our activities. Tonight, if you'd like to ask a question and you're here in person, please raise your hand and wait for one of us to come to you with a microphone. Not only will that make it easier for our speaker to hear your question, but it will also make it easier for anyone who's watching virtually to hear your question. And if you are watching virtually and want to ask a question, please type it, and we will do our best to ask it on your behalf. And now I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker. Dave Saums is a lifelong railroad buff and photographer, a member of Seacoast Art Association in Exeter, and has lived in Amesbury for 22 years. Also, he's fond of short introductions, which is okay with me. So, thank you for being here, Dave.
Thank you, Laura. Oh, well. Greetings, everyone. Thanks for coming. I have been told I'm on a tight leash time-wise, so I need to move right along. I have quite a few slides. I hope we will be able to dim the lights. That makes it more effective. I've titled this Online Dating, the Development of Snow Trains. I should ask first, has anyone here ridden a snow train? Last one ran in 1972. No one, all right. Anyone here have parents or grandparents who first met on a snow train? Bruce, good. Another, all right, good. I need to remember to ask that question because someone always puts their hand up in the audience and says, my grandparents met, which is why I'm on the planet. Anyway, the Boston Maine, a major railroad in New England, came up with a concept for what they called snow trains. And please note, I'm not terming this as ski trains. These are not ski trains. These were snow trains. Because this is really prior to the development of downhill skiing available to the general public as a general statement. The people who could afford to ski in 1930 were people who could well afford to go to Switzerland, take lessons, buy equipment, ship the equipment home. There were no rope tows. There were no ski slopes as we know them today. So this is prior to the development of alpine skiing, downhill skiing. Anyway, there was downhill skiing, but it was not for the average person. Okay. I've titled this Online Dating. I'm trying to have a little fun here. Obviously, there was no internet, so we weren't online in that sense. But if your grandparents met on a snow train, well, they were online. They were on the railroad. Okay, so that's the topic for tonight. The concept, invented by the Boston Maine Railroad in January of 1931, was wildly, spectacularly successful, and it spread across the United States and into Canada. I said at the bottom here, what we did for a date in Boston in 1931. This was the first poster that the B&M developed for the very first year, 1931. And the B&M, like many other major railroads in the country and in Canada at the time, were actually major contributors to the growth of artists around the two countries. The Santa Fe Railway, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, for example, was the single largest private art owner in the country. And that's because all of the work they did to open up what we now call the Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, southern Colorado, that was largely done by the Santa Fe Railway at a time when no one knew much about the history and the peoples of the area. If you had happened to walk into the headquarters of the Santa Fe in Chicago 30 years ago, as I did, you would have seen a lot of the artwork they had commissioned hanging on the walls all throughout the building. Literally, the railroads were major contributors to artistry in the United States. Here's an example. Each of these posters done each year, and I have two more I brought with me. These are original snow train posters. This one is from the Boston, Maine, 1935. This one is from the New Haven Railroad. Both of them, in each case, as did this one, then became the cover of the brochure that was published full of schedules for that year's schedule of snow trains. If you wonder, what in the world is a snow train, which was a common question at the time, this is from a B&M snow train that was operated over the weekend from December 30, 1933 to January 1, 1934. This is the depths of the Depression, the Great Depression. You left Boston I had to look it up to see, at 2:35 in the afternoon on Saturday, December 30, arrived in Littleton, New Hampshire, in this particular case for this train, this schedule, at 7:20 in the evening. So it was about 5 hours to get to Littleton. There was a sled ride arranged that started at 8 o'clock, and there was a movie being shown in the theater in town, and there was also a ball that was scheduled for the Opera House with dancing until midnight. What did you do the next day? This is the schedule for the next day. These were well-orchestrated events. You got your money's worth. I know we can't read it all necessarily, but you will see if you examine these schedules that there were many types of activities that were planned. So again, there were movies in the evening. There was a hockey game on Saturday night. There was downhill skiing, there was cross-country skiing, tobogganing, snowshoeing, skating, and often many of these trips also had bonfires organized in the small towns where that was the destination, dances, and so on. This is the Monday program. Oh, and on Sunday you were encouraged to go to church. This is the Monday, January 1st program, and I'm sorry my camera shot wasn't the best. And everything pretty much wrapped up by 2 in the afternoon so that you could get back to Boston, back on the train. This was so popular, I say it literally exploded in popularity. Here we see a photograph of 3 snow trains, all awaiting departure at the same time from North Station. I would assume that this may be a Saturday morning. This is from the official photographer at the time, Stanley Bauman, and the B&M had quite a very active publicity department, and several people served as official photographers for the various snow trains across New England. This is not a very good map, but I have highlighted here. This shows the Boston Maine at pretty much its fullest extent, covering a large part of New England. Let's see. The blue dot here is Plymouth, New Hampshire. That was a common destination. If you wondered where Warner, New Hampshire is, that's the red dot here. Here is Boston way down here. This is North Conway, New Hampshire, which is today where we find Conway Scenic Railroad on the former Conway branch of the B&M. And this is Crawford Notch here, the orange dot. So just to give you the general lay of the land for some of these destinations. The very first trip was operated for January 11, 1931, and it was scheduled to go from Boston's North Station to Warner, New Hampshire. This is Warner, New Hampshire. It's not a very big town. And in fact, if you ask, well, what railroad is there and where's the station in Warner? There is no railroad today. But, excuse me. Here's the station here, the passenger station here, the freight station here, and here's another view of the 2 of them at the time that this first snow train operated. The town of Warner is very proud of the fact that they were the very first destination for a snow train, the very first snow train. This was their bicentennial medallion they produced in 1974 for a celebration. And you'll see here, it shows not only a train at the station, but also it says first snow train, January 11, 1931. Interestingly enough, one of the questions the B&M struggled with was how to identify the people that had actually paid for tickets to ride on the snow train. Once they got to their destination, people were spread all over town. Well, initially, the B&M issued these cast pinback medallions that people would wear on their outer garment. A later version was simply a cloth patch. There was a lot of artistry involved in the publicity, as I mentioned. Just to give you an idea of the impact that this had, there are a lot of dates here, there are a lot of words, I know, but to go back to look first at how downhill skiing came to be established in the United States, the Dartmouth Outing Club was established in 1909 and is really given a lot of credit for pushing forward the concept of downhill skiing in the United States. Otto Schneebs came from Germany and formed the Alpine Ski School, he first gave classes in West Newton, Massachusetts in 1928. The Dartmouth Outing Club organized the very first ever downhill ski race in North America in 1928, and Otto Schneebs later became the coach of the Dartmouth ski team. The B&M ran that first snow train to Warner on January 11, 1931. At almost the same time, the Southern Pacific Railroad on the West Coast began running what they called Snowball Specials to Truckee. Very similar concept. I would point out that the third Winter Olympics were held in Lake Placid in 1932. This also did a great deal to promote the concept of downhill skiing, because people could read about some of the ski races and some of the ski jumping in the third Winter Olympics. The very first national downhill ski race was held at Mount Moosilauke in New Hampshire in 1933, and then the first rope tow was set up by the White Cupboard Inn in Woodstock, Vermont, and I was chastised very strongly because I gave this presentation to the Boston Maine Railroad Historical Society a number of years ago, and someone said immediately, "Wait a minute, you're not saying, no, we had the first rope tow in Woodstock." Okay. I don't want to get into an argument over who was first, but the first was in Canada. Don't tell anybody in Woodstock. Anyway, the first mechanical rope tow allowed people to just hold on to the rope and be pulled up the hill so they could ski. That was much better than a half-hour or 45-minute hike up the hill to get a minute and a half of downhill run. So the rope tow did a great deal to push forward downhill skiing. So that was the first rope tow in the U.S., January 1934. The New York Central Railroad, a major American railroad at the time, started their first snow trains out of Grand Central Terminal in New York City, in Manhattan, to Phoenicia, New York, in the Catskills in 1935. The New Haven began theirs. This is an example of a New Haven poster. The New Haven ran their first one to Norwalk, Connecticut in 1935. By 1936, the B&M operated 36 snow train schedules through the winter and carried 24,000 passengers. But look what happened the same year. The New York Central ran so many snow trains, and it was so wildly popular that they carried 30,000 passengers the same year, more than the B&M, the originator of the concept. The Central Vermont, I want to point out, also ran snow trains to Waterbury, Vermont. Okay. This is the third Winter Olympics. I've mentioned that. That's the brochure for the program. There were further expansions of the concept, and I've listed here other railroads around the northern part of the United States that began running snow train operations. The snow trains were discontinued for World War II. There were some schedules published for winter of 41. Trains ran, but December 7, of course, brought the end of everything of the sort. And so from 1942, January 42, until 1947, there were no snow trains operated. The B&M was able to start in 47, carried 20,000 passengers that year. The B&M's last snow train was operated in 1956. The Railroad Enthusiasts Incorporated, what today is known as the Massachusetts Bay Railroad Enthusiasts, began running a single annual snow train to North Conway, New Hampshire. That first one ran in 1964. The last one ran in February of 1972, and I'll show you some photographs of that. If you are interested in knowing, the Mass Bay Railroad Enthusiasts does run what they call generally a snow express once a year, typically in January, to North Conway. This year, there's no indication of one that's going to be operated. The very heavy drenching rains we had Saturday, 2 weeks ago, have caused some serious washouts, and so the Mountain Division is currently not operating to the best of my knowledge. If you were to ask where might some of these destinations for these trains have been, here's a list: Crawford Notch, Fabians, Intervale, the Laconia area, Plymouth, New Hampshire, North Conway, White River Junction, quite a few. The snow trains may have been operated either as a single-day excursion, typically on a Sunday, or They were run as multiple day, 2-day typically, excursions. And often there would be, for the Sunday trains, there would be what we call the sections. So there would be one train running on the schedule, and there would be such a demand, there would be a second train running behind it on the same, basically the same schedule with some time allowance, and then a third section, indicating how popular these were. The fares were quite low in our terms, $1.50. You could even ride a lower berth in a Pullman to Vermont for $3, but multiply that by about 20. From 1935 to today, the inflation every year has meant that a $3 fare in 1935 is a $60 fare today. Even so, that's still a pretty reasonable cost given how much you got for it in terms of all the activities that were organized. There was also a diner or a snack car on virtually every one of the B&M snow trains, and the diner would be open all day long, parked. You could access it at any time you wanted during the day, and you could order a lunch for 60 cents. You could order a full dinner for less than $1. These were really pretty reasonable prices. Again, though, multiply those by 20, and it's still a good deal compared to today. A common question was, where can we go? So this is taken out of one of the B&M's brochures. This shows schedules for Plymouth, New Hampshire. This is 1940, and Crawford Notch in February of 1940. Some more examples: to Intervale, New Hampshire in 1934 over the New Year's weekend, and to Littleton, New Hampshire also over the New Year's weekend for 1934-35. And I know that's a lot of type, but the point is just to give you an idea of what was involved and how complex all of these were. If you want to see what one looks like, here's a really bad photograph. But this is, I'm working from here, a tiny little print, 4.5 inches by 2 inches that I've scanned, and I've done my best to make it workable, but where are we? You can actually do this today. The engines are on top of Frankenstein trestle. We're on the grade up to Crawford Notch, which is literally right around the bend ahead of us. This will take us to Fabians, New Hampshire. There are 2 B&M Pacific steam locomotives, double-headed, so 2 crews. Steam locomotives required a crew in each cab, unlike diesels today. And there are 8 cars behind the 2 engines in this particular photograph. I know that because I'm reading the information that the photographer put on the back. I am really good. Here's another photograph. This is a little better. This is an eastbound 1940 snow train on the B&M. It's a B&M snow train, but it's running on the Maine Central's Mountain Division. So it's returning now from Fabians and Crawford Notch, eastbound back between Intervale and Bartlett. You can still ride this route today, barring any washouts, because Conway Scenic Railroad now operates on this same former Maine Central Mountain Division. This is what, well, things look a little crowded here, but in this case, this is 1946, so it's immediately post-war, and everybody seems to be bringing their skis and their poles on board into the coaches. Here's a series of photographs that I really have enjoyed seeing. These are from Trains Magazine. And in this case, there are 2 snow trains unloading at North Conway. This is 1930s, so prior to World War II. And apparently the photographer must have stood on, I'm thinking he's standing on the canopy right in front of the North Conway station in order to take this, the canopy over the passenger platforms in order to take this photograph. These were all exceedingly complex from the point of view of the operations for the railroad, for the transportation department of the railroad. There are many of these bulletins that give specific details with instructions to each of the officials involved in making sure that everything worked on time and correctly, and something like the baggage car being turned on the Y at Canaan, and so on and so on. These were quite complex operations, and of course they were passenger trains, yes, but passenger trains that went to specific destinations and then did things that were unusual compared to regular passenger service. You didn't normally have a passenger train sitting with a diner open all day for your convenience. Okay, these are some publicity photographs from the Boston, Maine. They came from the collection of Dwight Smith. If you don't know who Dwight Smith is, but you've been to Conway Scenic in North Conway, Dwight was a longtime B&M and railroad employee, and in about 1970, he started working on a plan to acquire the North Conway station, the engine house, the turntable, some land around it from the Boston, Maine, because the Boston, Maine was getting ready to shut down service. And that's Conway Scenic Railroad today. And Dwight is still with us. He is now, I believe, 96 years old and still going like a madman. These publicity photographs, I get a kick out of this. If you notice the blonde, and also the man who is clearly wearing some of his former Army gear. Here we have the same couple. Now they're unloading. This is North Conway. There's the blonde. There's the same man, and he's got his trench coat. And, oh, there they are again. How about that? Well, I think these are posed photographs. There's the North Conway station in the background. It was painted in those days much darker colors than today. And you can see the number of people that are unloading here. In the far distance, I also labeled, you can see the engine house in the distance beyond the snow trains that are unloading. In this case, there are 3 snow trains unloading at the same time. And I really enjoyed this. This is a school bus that's been put to work, and this sign up here on the top says Ski-mobile, and all the skis are being loaded up top there. Okay, return trip, time to go home. Ah, it's the same blonde and the same guy. How about that? Okay, what happened beyond the Boston, Maine? I've said already that this was a concept that spread very rapidly across the country. These are from my own collection, examples from the New Haven, the Great Northern Railway, the Boston and Albany, departing out of South Station, and then Framingham. This is a chart I tried to put together to highlight all the different locations where these various railroads ran these snow trains across eastern New York, northern New York, and northern New England. And the New Haven only extended, the furthest north the New Haven extended was Pittsfield, Massachusetts in the Berkshires. But these were all areas where there were ski centers that developed. In fact, there are 2 softcover books today that are titled Lost Ski Areas of the Berkshires, and they talk about the various ski areas that once existed. I grew up right here, 12 miles from Great Barrington, and it's exceedingly interesting to me to see how many ski areas there were that I certainly never knew about. I used different colors to highlight the areas. The Boston, Maine generally ran trips to these areas. The Rutland ran to Manchester, Rutland, relatively small schedule of snow trains. The New Haven to this small area. The New York Central here, to the Delaware and Hudson, to North Creek in the Adirondacks, which is today a center for downhill skiing, to Saranac Lake, Lake Placid, Jay, and then also all the way up to Sainte-Agathe, Sainte-Marguerite in Quebec, and that was with cooperation with the Delaware and Hudson and the Canadian Pacific Railway. Here's an example of a broadside from the Boston and Albany, which was owned by the New York Central, or was the 999-year lessee, long enough to survive. This was a snow train schedule running from Framingham to both Wilton, New Hampshire, and also North Conway and Ittervale. Oh, and that also will, that will give you an idea of some of the prices. The date for this, I said late 1930s. This is roughly 1939. And that would give you an idea for what the fares were for the round trip on the B&A. Sorry, going backwards, aren't I? There we go. The New York Central ran quite a complex schedule, as did the B&M, to a number of locations, New York, Massachusetts, and I mentioned already, up into the Adirondacks, and then to Canada, to Quebec. I took the opportunity to highlight Hillsdale in red because that's the town I grew up in. Here are some more of the New York Central's destinations, cooperation with the Rutland Railroad to 3 points in Vermont, and then also to Quebec. This created on the New York Central absolutely an explosion of interest in downhill skiing in the Catskills, and today the Catskills are still quite a ski center with a number of ski areas. And then even what was called the first international snow train operated again via the Canadian Pacific. This is another example of a poster that was developed by an artist named Ted Ray. This was done for the Boston and Albany to promote taking existing service, so regular daily service passenger trains from South Station in Boston to the Berkshires for skiing and winter sports. I'm going to move right along here. More examples of the areas in New York State and Western Massachusetts that were served. I originally grew up just a few miles from the Bronx on the Harlem division of the New York Central, which is Grand Central Terminal is built on land owned by the New York and Harlem Railroad. And towards the north end of the line was this very small hamlet of Hillsdale, which is where I grew up. This is a photograph, excellent photograph. This comes from John Hamm's collection in the Catskills. This is the Ulster and Delaware Railroad in the heart of the Catskill Mountains in Phoenicia with a snow train on the left and a snow train on the right. Some more examples. I know I'm moving along quickly, but I need to because I do have a lot of slides. Some more examples. This is Hillsdale. That's the station in the corner there. That's the station that I could see from my parents' house when I was growing up, and darn it, that's what turned me into a railroad buff. Here you have skiers unloading from, in this case, I believe this is a regular service Harlem Division passenger train from Grand Central, and I'm guessing this is a Saturday morning, and buses have been arranged across the street. The building in the background is the Globe Hotel. It doesn't exist anymore. There are buses that are loading the skiers on board to take them to the Catamount ski area, which is only a mile away. This is one of my own photographs from right in front of my house. This is the morning passenger train to Grand Central Terminal, which originated from Chatham, New York, 127 miles from Grand Central Terminal. But these regular service passenger trains, there was one to Grand Central in the morning and one returning at night back to Chatham. You could, in fact, use these passenger trains for access to Catamount ski area, and lo and behold, that's what a lot of people did. Here's another one of my own photographs. This is Washington's birthday in 1972. It's a Sunday-only passenger train that ran in the middle of the day, but way over here, every single person getting off the train that day had skis with them, and they were obviously heading to Catamount to go skiing. It's not quite a snow train, it's regular service, but nonetheless, mission accomplished. The New Haven ran operations to Canaan and Norfolk in Connecticut, to Great Barrington, South Lee, North Adams, Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and then in New Hampshire with connections via the Boston, Maine. Some of the New Haven's trains originated from Providence, some of them from New Haven, and some of them from Grand Central Terminal in Manhattan. Some more examples of, on the left, a brochure. On the right, this was the Central Vermont's publicity poster. This was one of a pair. The other one shows a very pretty young woman, but she's wearing a very short skirt and a blouse that only seems to have one button. It doesn't seem like good downhill skiing attire. But I think that's called artist's license. On the Rutland, there were very few operations on the Rutland that I've been able to find evidence of. These were the destinations in Vermont, and I've included here the Middlebury College Winter Carnival because that was a very important event in northern Vermont in the wintertime. Here is a tremendous photograph from the Manchester Historical Society, Manchester, Vermont. This is the Manchester Passenger and Freight Station, and look at the lineup of people and how many of them have skis. Some of them have, yes, they look like they're in more formal attire, but these are all skiers heading back to New York City. A bit of a mystery photograph, but I haven't been able to find a date for this. But this is the end of day. Everyone's loading back on board, and there doesn't seem to be a locomotive visible here. I'm assuming the locomotive is running around the train and out of sight in the photograph here. I've mentioned that these were very complex operations, but in this case, for the New York Central and the Rutland operations, they also produced these multi-page bulletins that were handed out to everyone who is a passenger, and they gave an exceeding amount of detail. I won't bore you with everything that's in all this, but if you can read this, it says, skiers who are guests at houses number 6, 7, 9, 10, and 11 may, if they wish, remain on the train until it reaches East Dorset. The point of mentioning this is, with the very first snow train to Warner, New Hampshire in 1931, every single person who was riding that snow train, when they showed up in the small town of Warner, New Hampshire, the railroad had gotten all the homeowners in town to agree to take in 1 or 2 people and board them for the night. You're going to have strangers from the city come and stay in my house? I don't know these people, but people did it. At the time, people did it. And the B&M then issued a dinner menu to every single household. So everyone in town served the same menu to all the passengers. That's how orchestrated this was. The fact is, Warner, New Hampshire is so proud of this that the Warner Historical Society put on an event which I attended, and it was the same menu from that night. I thought that was superb. Great work by an historical society. Okay, moving on. That was 1938. This is a long broadside that I have in my possession, and I've had to cut it apart in order to be able to show you at least a couple of pieces of it. And what's really of interest here to me is these are no longer just coaches that you're riding in. A lower berth in a Pullman, an upper berth. You could even get either a drawing room or a compartment. Are you kidding me? To go skiing. That is just great. Of course, $11 in 1938, multiply that by 20. But you know what? That's still a heck of a lot better than Amtrak prices today for something equivalent to a drawing room or a compartment. Bob, not to bash Amtrak. Some of us are big believers. And by the way, if you haven't ridden the Downeaster just up to Portland or up to Brunswick or up to Freeport and back, it's a wonderful trip. And if you examine the schedule carefully on a weekend, you can ride up in the morning, for example, to Freeport or to Brunswick. In Brunswick, you'll get 5 hours on the ground. You can eat lunch at the Irish pub in the station. You can walk down to the center of town or to the big Cabot Antiques Mall. Downeaster service is wonderful. It's also the single most successful new service, state-supported service offered by Amtrak in the last 20 years, and it's been that way every 20 years. The same thing is now happening in Vermont. The ridership numbers for the extension a year ago in July of the Ethan Allen Express from Grand Central to Albany to Burlington, Vermont, the ridership numbers are through the roof. And it says something about when you provide good service with good schedules, people will ride. Anyway, if you looked at these fares for this particular service to Manchester and Rutland on the Rutland Railroad, these are the 1938 fares. I mentioned that you can even get a compartment or a drawing room. That is just astounding to me. It's no longer just a coach seat that was offered. Here's the Manchester station, looking rather dilapidated, and you'll see the big sign is still up, Manchester Ski Center. I want to move on to leave enough time for questions. The discussion and some examples of the what I've called here modern day B&M snow trains. After World War II, I said earlier 1947, it was 1946, I apologize. The B&M started running a snow train schedule again every winter. These were the same one-day Sunday excursions, and in many cases with multiple sections. The fares were still fairly reasonable, $2.50 to $3, so multiply that by 20, so $40 to $60. Excuse me. The steam locomotives were operated on these trains after the war. I have not yet come across, as a railroad buff, some of the photographs I would have expected to see of some of the diesel engines on these trains. Everything I've found so far seems to indicate steam locomotives as the power. The last B&M snow train operated in 1956. This is Model Railroader magazine from December 1988. My friend George Drury has passed away, but he wrote an extensive article about North Conway Station, and this is the cover of that issue showing his model of the North Conway Station. And here's a drawing of the station from that same article and the article itself. This is what is today the Conway Scenic Railroad, as I mentioned, founded by Dwight Smith. Here are some examples of the snow train posters that the B&M had produced using area artists. 1950 in this case. Now it's converted, instead of an artist's handwork, it's now a photograph, a posed photograph, obviously posed photograph. 1951. Another one from the early 50s. This is the Boston Maine's employee magazine in 1950, and surprisingly, there's very little text in Brian Jennison, a friend of mine in Newmarket, New Hampshire, a retired railroader and a PhD from Berkeley. He has collected virtually every single issue of the B&M employee magazine starting back in the, I believe, the teens. And he loaned me these to show, so I could show these. This is the January 1950 cover. Unfortunately, there was no text article inside talking about snow trains, which was quite a disappointment. This is a photograph that's quite interesting. This is from Carl Byron, Boston Maine Railroad Historical Society. Thank you, Carl. This is a private snow train operation run by the Boston Maine, chartered by the John Hancock Life Insurance Company as an employee outing, in this case to Warner, New Hampshire, February 1950. I think that must have been a lot of fun if you were an employee. I suspect the company subsidized that. These are some examples of tickets. Now some photographs. This is a snow train that was operated by the railroad enthusiasts in 1965. It was bound for North Conway, New Hampshire, but this one is infamous because there was a B&M snowplow on the branch operating ahead of the passenger excursion, and the snowplow derailed. So they got as far, this is the Mount Whittier station, they got as far as Mount Whittier and could go no further. Back to Boston. This is one of Brian Jennison's photographs. I mentioned Brian a minute ago. This is December of 1970. It's the month that the B&M declared bankruptcy, and this is an RRE snow train on its way through Dover, New Hampshire, on its way to North Conway. Here is North Conway in 1970, February 1970. This is a photograph by Jack Swanberg from Connecticut. And you can see the condition of the station at that time. It's now painted in brighter colors than it was in the previous photograph you saw, which was a black and white photograph. But you can see that the windows are boarded up. The station, well, it's no longer a passenger station for regular service, so it's rather an orphan at this point. But this is what Dwight bought from the B&M, along with the engine house and turntable across the tracks over here to the left, and this is what became the core of the Conway Scenic Railroad we have today. This is an Ektachrome transparency. It's a series of transparencies that I've bought. I have been swapping and acquiring and, buying Kodachrome and Ektachrome and black and white negatives since I was in high school of railroad topics. This is another one of the railroad enthusiasts snow trains at North Conway. I don't know the photographer and I don't know the date, but I would say this is 1969 or 1970. Here's another one of these absolutely gorgeous transparencies showing the North Conway station, and the odd pit here in the foreground to the left is you really can't see it, but the turntable is there. That's and the engine house is out of view to the left here. Here is now the 1971 snow train, a bit more snow. This photograph from Scott Hartley in Connecticut. This is the 1971 train also, I believe, don't know for sure, and I do not know the photographer in this case, but this is another of the railroad enthusiast snow trains from Boston North Station to North Conway. Oh, yes, and it's snowing, unlike today. These are two really terrible black and white images. They've been badly abused. I did the best I could with them. The photographer is Neil Richardson. I appreciate having them nonetheless. The upper left view is Dover, New Hampshire. The lower right is the same train in Rochester, New Hampshire. What's unusual here? These are not just self-propelled bud cars. This train was now operated in February 72 by the B&M with two heavy freight locomotives in the lead. The reason was there was a major snowstorm blowing in, and if it looks like it, well, it was. This is the same train in Sanbornville, New Hampshire, a coming and going scene, 1972. Here we are again in Mount Whittier. More snow, more overcast, getting darker. And here's what the train looked like when it arrived at North Conway. This is photographed by James Harold, and it came from Bob Wilt in Pennsylvania. So you see the two B&M diesel locomotives and the RDCs behind, and I think the lead unit seems to show some evidence that there really was snow that year. Dave Hutchinson isn't here, is he, Dave? No. Okay. Dave Hutchinson's lifelong railroader. He's now retired. This is his photograph of B&M trainmaster Lester Stevenson clearing out the switch points. It's February 72. It's that same train in that heavy snowstorm, and they're running the power around the RDCs in order to begin the run back to Boston. Another of Dave's photographs here. In this case now, they're backing up towards the RDCs that are out of sight around the curve up at the station. February 72. Douglas Kidd, another lifelong railroader, also now retired and member of Boston Maine Railroad Historical Society, as I guess we all are, took this photograph of that same train. He marched down the right-of-way and then down through the snow. The station is hard to see, but these are the two towers of the North Conway station here. And the engine house would be here, but I'm guessing those are cars in the yard. Here they're just getting ready to depart. And we can still do this on occasion today. This is one of my own photographs from a year ago, January 7. This was the Massachusetts Bay Railroad Enthusiasts Covered Wagons in the Snow excursion. And this ran from North Conway Scenic Railroad, up to Intervale, to Bartlett, to Crawford Notch. Didn't quite go to Crawford Notch. Got as far as Notchland Inn, and that's where we are right now. The engines have run around the excursion train, and they're getting ready to depart. January 7 of last year. And this is Corey Fothergill. He was the engineer that day. I was hoping he might be here with his father, but I don't see them. Corey is the engineer for the New Hampshire North Coast Railroad, running out of Ossipee every day. And he has been the principal mechanic working on doing the mechanical work for the rebuilding of these two locomotives. These are locomotives from the mid-1950s. They're as old as I am. And Corey is, I'm not sure he's even hit 40 yet, but he's a great engineer. And if you try to chase the New Hampshire North Coast sand trains, be forewarned. This track speed limit is 40. Corey runs at 40. It's hard to outdo him on the parallel roads. Anyway, he was running the train that last Mass Bay trip, January of last year. Just a quick look again at a better map. If you're not familiar with the Conway Scenic Railroad, oops, I didn't want to do that. Pointer? There we go. This is North Conway, New Hampshire here, just above the sand pit in Ossipee. This is the former Conway branch of the Boston Maine, which used to run up here to North Conway and then to Intervale, where it met the Mountain Division of the Maine Central. I've got some references here for anybody who cares. If you are interested and want to know more, I can certainly give you a card and you can send me an email. I'd be happy to send you the list of references. There are a lot of contributors for the photographs you've seen here and for some of the materials and information. I won't try to read through all this, of course. I'm the editor for the Rutland Railroad Historical Society quarterly magazine, which is called the Newsliner. Our membership is $20 a year. You get 4 wonderful issues a year, 128 pages of heart-stopping information about the Rutland Railroad, which disappeared in Vermont and northern New York in 1963, 60 years ago. But we have a lot of fun. It's a pretty small group. Here's an example of, this was a 3-part article, the series that I wrote for the magazine several years ago about snow trains, principally in Vermont. I would like to dedicate this to a man that I first met when I was 15 years old. His name is Jim Shaughnessy. He was an RPI graduate in Troy, New York. He never left Troy. He was a civil engineering graduate, and he was a professor for Hudson Valley Community College and worked for a couple of engineering firms. He passed away, unfortunately, in August of 2018. His first book was published as a history of the Rutland Railroad in Vermont and northern New York State, and I consider that to be the very first modern example of how to write a railroad history book in this country. His last book was titled Essential Witness, and that's over here. A tremendous photographer. That's Jim with his speed graphic. It's a photograph taken by Jeff Browse from LaGrangeville, New York. And here's Jeff in his, Jim in his library at his house. Great photograph by Greg McDonald from Ontario. Wonderful man. As editor of the Rutland Railroad Historical Society, every time I would write to Jim or call him and ask him, do you have some photographs of X, whatever the subject was, a Kodak yellow box would appear in the mail with 20 photographs, Jim Shaughnessy photographs. Wonderful. Absolutely great man. Anyway, thanks. That's what I have today. Thank you. Laura, the last version of this presentation that I gave was an hour and 20 minutes, so I've done pretty well. I'm only 1 minute over by that clock. Questions? Bruce, yeah.
I was wondering, you mentioned the locomotives had to go around the cars for the return trip, and yet I've seen many trains where the locomotive stayed at the back and simply reversed and brought the cars back.
Oh, that's modern day.
Oh, okay, that was just what they did back in the day?
No. Today, MBTA, for example, runs commuter trains out of Boston. Great question. Every commuter train has locomotive only on one end. Amtrak puts what appears to be a locomotive on each end of a Downeaster train set, but you're being fooled because the locomotive that's on the east end leading towards Portland is actually a powered locomotive. The locomotive on the opposite end is a former locomotive that's been gutted. It has no prime mover, it has no alternator. Its primary purpose is crew safety. A locomotive is something to be in. If you're going to hit a tractor trailer at a grade crossing, you want to be in a locomotive. You don't want to be in a cab car with no protection. I frankly don't understand why the unions allow commuter trains to operate with a locomotive only on one end, because it's a safety issue. In past years, we didn't do what we do today. So the locomotive was always on the head end of a passenger train. The locomotive was always on the head end of a freight train, and there was a caboose on a freight train. In those days, we don't do that. And today, if you go any other part of the country, the longest freight train ever run was just operated in the West. I think it was close to 4 miles long. You don't want to be at a grade crossing. But if you are on I-80 across Nebraska, you will be passed by a 15,000-ton coal train going east, and the coal train's doing 70 miles an hour. So the world is a little different in other parts of the US and Canada in terms of how railroads operate. Around here, we've suffered with this thing called Guilford and then Pan Am, and thank heavens the railroad now has been purchased by CSX, and times are changing quickly for the railroad through town here, if you weren't aware. Yes? Yep.
I assume there was no snow train in Maine, or you would have told us about it.
If there was a snow train in Maine that was labeled as a snow train specifically, I don't know that myself. If someone else knows better, I would certainly be interested in knowing. I've collected, as you can probably tell, I've got piles of material. Well, you don't want to see my house. My living room is the filing cabinet for the Rutland Railroad Historical Society. My dining room is my filing cabinet for my own photography. Oh boy, this gets out of hand. But to answer your question, I'm not aware that there were snow trains labeled as snow trains operated 2 points in Maine. I could well be quite wrong.
So if this was 1930s online dating and people were going for multiple nights, were there boarding houses, or like you said, Rutland had people take in
Absolutely.
Skiers. So what did people do for overnight accommodations?
If you were to take a look at Warner, New Hampshire in January of 1931, directly across the street from the passenger station is the Colonial Inn. And I'm sure that was a banner weekend for the owner of the Colonial Inn. But in each case, if you think about that date, January 1931, depths of the Depression, people who lived in Boston didn't have a car. You couldn't get there from here. So the reason the snow trains were so successful, in my opinion, is it created, yes, if you think about the relative cost of a dollar then versus a value of a dollar then versus a dollar today, if you made one trip on a snow train in a wintertime, it was your winter experience, getting away from the city, getting away from work. And that was at a time when people worked, the work week was 5.5 days, typically, or 6 days for a lot of people. So if you could take a one-day excursion, and okay, if it was $1.50 and it was a coach seat for a Sunday, multiply by 20, that's $30. If you did that once in a winter, that was a pretty good outing, and you got an awful lot for your money. If you stayed overnight, yes, arrangements had to be made, and in all the details that there's just no way I could bore you with all the details here. But if you saw, I mentioned on the Rutland, for example, in their bulletin they handed out to passengers, there were specific houses assigned. You know, Joe and his wife was assigned to house 10 in Dorset. So he had to stay on. They had to stay on the train because the train stopped in Manchester and Arlington, and then it went on to Dorset. And their house was in Dorset. So it was that level of detail that was involved. So it used inns that were open, and not all inns were open across New England, because who's going to stay at an inn in the middle of the winter on a frigid February night if you can't get there, if you don't own a car? You can't afford the gasoline. Thanks, good question. I'm sorry I didn't make that clear.
Okay, 2 questions. One, now, did you have to buy your tickets well in advance? Could you buy them on the train? What was going on with that? And the other one, my second question is, what's RDC?
Oh, sorry, rail diesel car.
Okay, thank you.
It's a self-propelled form of passenger coach invented by the Budd Company in 1950. The Boston Maine was the largest purchaser and operator of RDCs in the world. And some of those still exist. There happens to be one burned out in Boston, but it's supposedly going to be renovated, restored, and returned to service somewhere. I happened to ride an RDC in Rockland, Maine this past August because Finger Lakes Railway of Central New York now has the contract to operate the former Maine Central Rockland branch for freight service, and they've been willing to start working on how to organize passenger service also. So they have a fully renovated RDC that came from Texas that they ran on demonstration runs out of Rockland in August. And the state of Maine completely rebuilt that branch, and man, it's all welded rail, heavy ballast. I mean, it's a nice ride. Unfortunately, the major shipper on the branch in Thomaston is a cement company, and they announced in September or beginning of October that they were going to shut down the plant. So it's not clear that that branch, what's going to happen there, and whether there will be continued passenger operation. The first question. There's a lot of detail involved here. You listened to the radio in Boston on a Thursday night, and the publicity manager for the B&M had arranged with the radio station. They had, they had a forecast for snowfall, and they knew how much snowfall there was and whatever the destinations were. So you listen to the radio on Thursday night to determine which one of these trips is going to run because there's enough snow on the ground to make it worthwhile. And then you went to North Station, you bought your ticket. You had to buy the tickets at North Station in person, no online ticket sales. But there wasn't any selling of tickets on board, because the railroad needed to know how many people to plan for all of these various trips to all the, and if you think of this, these brochures, I should have brought one with me. Some of them are 50 pages of schedules. It's incredible how complex this operation became. And why was it important to the railroad? In 1931, the railroad had commuter train passenger service employees who were idle on the weekend. Everybody needed to earn an income. If you could earn an additional day's income, manna from heaven. It's the Depression. If the railroad could put idle commuter equipment to work and generate some revenues and some good publicity for the railroad, good for the railroad. It worked for everybody. It was literally a success because it worked for everyone. Sure. Well, I had more hours of economics, undergraduate and graduate school. So to me, this is a fascinating story in terms of what can be done with some original thinking. And you would never have guessed, in the worst years of the Depression, this is what the railroad came up with? Really? Yeah.
I was remembering starting out with skis that came to the top of your fingertips and seeing the length. Do you ever speak to young school groups, and do they respond when they see the length?
I've only done this for historical societies. Yeah. Young people having an interest. I have a friend in Midtown Manhattan. She's agreed to be a co-author with me on a book about the railroad line I grew up on. She's half my age. She sends me only text messages. She does not use the telephone, will not call, will not send emails, only text messages, and drives me nuts. I'll get a text message from her, and 30 seconds later, I'll get another one that says, "Why haven't you answered?" Maybe it was 10 o'clock and I was asleep. She knows I fell asleep. This past week, she sent me a text message. It was just a small image of a dinosaur.
I'm wondering if there was much interest in the summertime for people to go up to the sort of sightseeing in the northern parts of New Hampshire on the train as well.
The railroads did everything they could to promote passenger service usage. There's no question about that. And there was a time when railroads in this country, everything we're talking about here was privately operated, privately owned. If you've been to Grand Central Terminal in New York, imagine that was built, that entire city block was built with private capital. There's no government funding. The railroads had every interest in generating as much revenue as they could, whether it was freight or passenger. And some major railroads, like the Union Pacific, like the Great Northern, right up until the day that Amtrak started, May 1st, 1971, they were still promoting, still advertising, still washing windows on their passenger cars. The food service was excellent. Those days are past us. Now we think government has to do everything, government has to pay for everything. And the fact is, operating a passenger train is a very expensive operation. There's no question that these major railroads were losing substantial money in operating passenger railroads by the time 1957, 58 came around. If you wonder why we've lost so much, it's because we all decided we liked driving. You get in your car without thinking, start the engine and go to wherever you want to go, whether it's to the grocery store or whether it's to Conway. We love it, but it did end other forms of transportation. We don't have trolleys anymore. Right here in this square, you could ride 1,000 miles by trolley. Same thing in Amesbury. I live in Amesbury. The number of trolley lines radiating out of Amesbury and Haverhill and so on was astounding. All gone. We're over time. I'm in big trouble. I'm never coming back again, I promise. Anyone else? Laura?
Okay, thank you
All right.
very,
Thanks
very
a lot,
much.
everybody.
Thank you, Dave.